we will be able to hear Greg and Dave.
Good morning, everybody. I'll start. I'm assuming you can hear me. Good morning. My name's Dave Harvey. I'm the Inclusion Support Service Manager for Hampshire County Council. I work in the wider inclusion team, and the Inclusion Support Service is, in case you aren't aware, covers all areas to do with inclusion, i.e. keeping children in school. Often we deal with exclusion. We deal with attendance, so I have an attendance officer. We deal with elective home education, which is, you might not be surprised to hear, is a bit of a growing area at the moment. And I also commission places at education centres, which are pupil referral units. And those are the main things that the Inclusion Support Service does. And if I just quickly introduce Greg, who works for me, he's our data king. Greg, do you want to have a quick word to tell them what you do?
Yeah, I'm Greg Sturgis. I'm a senior inclusion assistant, and as Dave said, I sort of collate the data for the team. So across the team in regard to exclusions, elective home education, and reduced hours. I collate it, form reports, and provide it to outside agencies, local people within the local authority, our schools, and also I work within the inclusion team, mostly regarding exclusions and reduced hours. So providing advice and support to schools, to parents, to governors, to teachers, doing lots of different things.
Thanks very much, Greg. Okay, just talk very briefly about reduced hours provision, first of all, because that's very interesting. We've been collecting data on reduced hours provision for about 2 years now. Up until 2 years ago, we didn't really have an awful lot of data. And the DfE then basically said local authorities have got a duty to have a handle on reduced hours provision. That was an interesting DfE statement because, yep, we have a duty, but how do we know? And we in Hampshire, we build on our excellent relationships we have with schools, and we do have good relationships with schools, and that's key. So there's not a single school in Hampshire that doesn't work with us. That includes academies, that includes anything else, primary and secondary and special. So we rely on schools to inform us when a child is on a reduced hours provision. I think it's fair to say that in the first year we collected data, we weren't sure whether that was because there was no data to collect or because schools hadn't told us. By and large, schools will inform us, and they will inform us because there's some good carrots for them to do so. One of the carrots being that if Ofsted come a calling on a school and look at the registers or discover there's a child on a part-time timetable, the first thing they will ask the school is, have you informed the local authority? And they will then cross-reference that. So we get calls in from Ofsted to say, how many children are on part-time timetables at such and such a school? If they've told us and they provided us, and when they tell us, I'll get Greg to talk about this in a moment in more detail, they provide us with a plan around that child to get him or her back to full-time education, then all well and good. Ofsted tend to be quite happy. Although there are issues around the length of duration of a reduced hours timetable, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Of course, if they haven't told us, then Ofsted are immediately onto the school. And technically it's a safeguarding issue because children are entitled to a full-time education. Part-time has to be agreed by parents. That can sometimes be tricky. And I'll talk a little bit more about that if you like. First of all, definition of full-time education. If we were doing this in a live audience, I'd say to you, how many hours? And you can You can send it in your chat if you like. How many hours do you think is a full-time education? I'll give you a second to think about that. Okay. Sad, I can't see any answers. Oh, someone says 30. You're wrong, I'm afraid. No, bit excessive there. No. Actually, it's, I'll put you out of your misery. It's 18 hours. You know, let that sink in. 18 hours. And that means that a child could attend school from 8 to 1 o'clock, 5 hours a week, 5 hours more a day, do that 5 days a week, and they've got 25 hours. So that's not 18 hours. It's considerably more. There's guidance from the DfE in the 1996 Education Act around infants to do roughly curriculum guidance 21 hours, juniors I think it's 22, 23, secondary, Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4, 24, 25, but that's not the legal time. What we define reduced hours as is children who are getting less than their peers in their school. So if a child if the school runs a 24-hour week timetable, then if a child's doing anything less than that, then it's reduced hours. And by reduced hours, we don't include things. So, sorry, I'm confusing there. By reduced hours, I mean when the child hasn't got access to any education formally. So, for instance, if a child was doing in a secondary level, was doing work experience for 1 day a week, that doesn't mean that they're getting reduced hours. They're just getting a different experience. Or if they go to college for a day a week, or if they do equine therapy, or if they have counselling, all of those would be included in the hours. The bits we're interested in is when a child isn't getting any provision. And that's what we mean by reduced hours provision. And that's what we call it, reduced hours provision. And it needs and requires schools to work closely with parents. We get lots of calls from parents who I feel they might be coerced into that. And it's about the relationship with the school and the parent and holding the child at the centre. So reduced hours provision, we would argue 6 weeks is what we would normally say is the maximum length of time. And in that time, there's a plan to get the child in full time. In practice, that doesn't always work. Children who are medically unwell, for example, they would have reduced hours provision because, again, it's about as much as they can manage, reasonably manage. And sometimes to have a child in full time sets the child up to fail. So there has to be some plan to encourage them back into full time. Okay, I mean, in a nutshell, then, we are reliant on schools telling us. We collect masses of data, and I'm just going to ask Greg to talk about the sort of data that we do collect. So over to you, Greg.
Okay. Yeah, so as Dave said, it's statutory for local authorities to know, but it's not statutory for schools to tell us. So as Dave said, it's up to our really good relationships with schools to tell us. And the way they do tell us is via online data collection forms. So they just fill in an online form, which gives us the important context for why our child needs to be on reduced hours. Because context is incredibly important. Because as Dave said, we expect that it should be a last resort. We expect it as part of a support plan, and we expect that it should be a maximum of 6 weeks. And at that 6 weeks period, it is reviewed. Now, if a school suggests that this child needs to be on reduced hours and there's no context, you would question, okay, why is this child on reduced hours? And you especially would question that if they're on reduced hours for longer than 6 weeks. But context is very important. So, for example, there was a form I received yesterday about a child that's pregnant, and they were receiving one less lesson a week. So they were having 24 hours. And obviously, being pregnant, that reduced hours is going to probably continue for quite a while. and the hours may be reduced because obviously fatigue and seeing the community nurse and such. If there is no context to describe why that child's on reduced hours, then there'll be questions. But because the school is explaining this is why, X, Y, Z, then you can understand. So it's all about providing the context. And that form is where you provide that context. So it's where they put the name of the children, the name of the child, date of birth, year group, school name. I'm just going down the form at the moment and just seeing what they put on there. It's very important that they put the start date of when that reduced hours provision started and when the proposed end date is. Now, as we said, we suggest that should be 6 weeks. And we have a system where we can send out emails to these schools saying, okay, you said that this reduced hours provision was going to finish on 12th of October. What's happening? What's the update? Can you provide us with an update to see how many hours that child is on? What's the provision? What's the plan? How's it changed for the child and for the school and for the circumstances? So we have a script that does that. It's sort of like a robot that sends out those emails. We also ask the school to give any review dates because we expect a 6-week review, but it's good practice to have lots of informal, perhaps weekly reviews, where maybe near the end of the week that the parents and the school work in partnership to say, okay, that worked this week, or that didn't work this week. How was the child when they came home? So it's a discussion, some sort of informal discussion to see how it could move on each week. And then we would say we ask for the types of provision, so the number of hours that they're in school, or maybe, as Dave said, that perhaps they've got a few hours in college or in work placement, or maybe some home tuition, or maybe some twilight. So that's some time at school after usual school hours. We also ask them to give a reason for the lack of that full-time provision, and reasons could be it's part of a school support plan. It could be for medical reasons. It could be for an integration, so the child has been away from school for a particular reason, and the school have deemed that it's best fit for that child to be integrated slowly into that school, so not full-time straight away, maybe mornings only for a few weeks and then try to build that up. And perhaps reintegration after a lengthy exclusion, where head teachers seem appropriate to put that exclusion in, so similar to integration. We would expect a couple of statements. A, it's been agreed by parents. That's what we definitely need to see that. So if that was not ticked by a school, we would be questioning. It's good practice for there to be a minuted meeting taking place. There needs to be a written education plan in place. So there doesn't have to be a specific reduced hours plan. That could be a sort of in-house plan that the school has done all around the child. So they sometimes call that a individual behaviour management plan or a personal education plan. And we would expect that the reduced hours is part of that. And also it's a necessity for a risk assessment to be completed if that child is deemed to be vulnerable. So if they're on a child protection plan, or if they're on an EHCP, children in need, looked after, and we would say it's very good practice if a child is not part of those vulnerable groups. It's still very good practice to have a risk assessment to make sure that when the child is not at school, so when the school staff don't see that child, that they're going to be safe. Because obviously it's still the responsibility of the school to make sure that child is safe even when they're not with them during those school hours. We also collect whether the child that they are suggesting about reduced hours, if they are part of a vulnerable group. So if they're part of EHCP, child protection, looked after, free school meals, children in need. And we collect that, and then we're able to produce reports and data around the numbers of children, for example, known to have an EHCP that are on reduced hours. And then we also we require the name of the person supervising it. So sometimes a head teacher or a deputy head teacher who's normally in charge of pastoral care, and an email, which is very important as part of that script that we can, that robot I mentioned, where it sends out emails so we can get an update, and a phone number in case we wanted to talk about the case, if there was a couple of questions that we wanted to ask. So when that information is filled in, when it is completed, it then zooms off in an email to me, and then I then collect that information and put it on the local authority database as such, the systems. That system, that database, is where I can pull then the data from. And as they said as well, certainly in the last 2 years, that data is a lot more mature, a lot more robust, and there's a lot of interest in that data around the local authority and what we can do with that to have a talk with schools. So that's sort of the process in regard to data collection, and the process that the schools must follow. I'll pass you back to Dave.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Okay, there's some questions filtered through.
Thanks, Greg. What I've done is I've pinged some questions over to Dave.
Yeah, I'm going to respond to them now, if that's okay. Yeah, and I'll try and give you some information. I thought one of the things people might like to know is
That's brilliant.
How many children are on reduced hours provision. Last year, obviously the year we've got full data for, 1920, there are about 1,500 children at some point during the year have been on reduced hours provision. Of those, about a third, yeah, at some point, yes, 1,500 roughly, at some point had been on reduced hours provision. About a third of those were medical, so about 500 were children with medical needs. So they were doing as much as they could manage. In answer to some of the questions come through, well, the first one was, if a child's on a reduced timetable, do they count as absent? Yes, they do. It's an authorised absence, so that will show up on the school statistics, which will be picked up that way. And I would expect any child who's on a reduced hours provision to have involvement from the school Senko. That should be automatic. And there should be lots of actions around the input to how we're going to get this child back to a full-time provision, because that's what they're entitled to. So it counts as absence is recorded as authorised. That's the first thing. Okay, moving on. Good question. How do we know if the school's telling us? Well, we have to trust schools, and we do. Quite often parents contact us independently. Mm-hmm. So a parent who's concerned that the child's on a reduced hours timetable may phone my office and speak to people like Greg, or they write, and we can follow up that way. Where schools systematically aren't telling us, then I have a conversation with the head teacher. You can imagine how that conversation goes, and that works well. Generally speaking, we're continually reminding schools that they have to let us know. So I attend head teacher network meetings. We put out on schools comm. I think it's fair to say there aren't many schools that don't know. One of the things we did last year was, for those schools where we had a nil return, and we collect the data, Greg has all the data on this. So, and for the vast majority of, the vast number of primary schools, they don't return anything, neither nil or reduced hours timetable. And that's because they don't have any children on reduced hours timetables. We produce that list, we share that with colleagues in the Hampshire Inspection and Advisory Service, HIAS. And when LLPs meet with the schools, or the SIM meets with the school, a quick question might be, see you've got no children on reduced hours provision, is that correct? And most schools will confirm that that is correct. There are one or two secondary schools which are a little bit reluctant to give up this data, but we're on to them as well. So as you said, as Greg said, we have a statutory duty to know, but schools don't have a statutory duty to tell us, which is a bit unfortunate, but that's the way it is. I hope that answers that question. There's a second question. If the child is in other settings, how do you ensure the child can follow the curriculum? Okay, let's just, it's okay, let me just explore that a little bit, what I think that is meant by that question. Most children attend their mainstream school 100% of the time. There are some children who are in other settings. For instance, they might be on work experience or a college placement, or they might have some alternative provision. The home school, which is the main school, they have responsibility for that child's education, the oversight of it. So the curriculum, that is their responsibility to make sure the child's accessing it. Some children are dual rolled with education centres, which Hampshire calls its pupil referral units education centres. There are 7 in the county. Roe Hill in the northeast, Ashwood in Basingstoke and Dean, Smamel in the Andover area, Bridge, Eastleigh, Winchester, and the Key, which has 2 sites, one in Gosport and one in Havant. They take children who are either permanently excluded, and if they're permanently excluded, they're single rolled, so the education centre has the responsibility, as would a school. Medically unwell, we commission places for emotionally vulnerable children and medically unwell. They're dual rolled, and also for children at risk of permanent exclusion, they can be dual rolled. And whilst the education centre may be delivering 100% of their education, the home school is still the responsible school. So they can't just wash their hands if a child is at risk of permanent exclusion. They have to monitor, take care, regular meetings, review, and so forth. Children at education centres can sometimes be on reduced hours timetables. I think I'm not giving too much away to say that's one of the areas which is probably of highest concern for me, the number of children who are at an education centre who are on reduced hours provision. Because those children are our most vulnerable children and they should be getting their full entitlement. So it's up to the home school, where the child's dual rolled, it's up to the home school to follow that through. They are responsible, and we make that very clear, and schools accept
Dave,
that.
can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Can I bust in and ask a question? You've said that 18 hours is full-time provision. Is there anything that has to happen in that 18 hours? Does that 18 hours have to be particular subjects, or, you know, we've talked about what's reduced, but in fact, is it actually essential that they're covering particular subjects within that time?
No, it's not. There's nothing prescribed in that area. Obviously, you know, English, maths, numeracy and literacy are the key issues. But no, there's no guide about what is taught at all. That is an interesting question. I will say
it just occurs to me that theoretically, you know, a child could be actually in school but actually missing out on perhaps the critical stuff, and that there isn't any sort of rule about which bits they need to be in for.
Yeah, you broke up a little bit during that. What you said, I think what you said was basically, let's say a child's doing mornings only, and they're missing, and English is spread across mornings and afternoons, and they're missing the afternoon sessions. How do you ensure that that child isn't disadvantaged by being on a reduced hours timetable? And that therein lies the issue. And schools, for any child on a reduced hours timetable, the plan around the school needs to take that into account. So very often, especially at secondary level, then often children drop some subjects. That's, you know, for instance, they might drop, I don't know, French or or Spanish or something, they might drop an option subject. The expectation would be that schools would focus on the core curriculum, which is essentially English, maths, PHSE, IT, and also some physical. It's important that it gets some physical interaction. But again, it's not prescribed exactly what children should teach. It should be taught. I hope that answers that question. Let me just move on to the other questions. When I thought there was no communication with teachers to be able to let people know what. Okay, I think things have moved on a little bit. I would expect there to be plenty of communication. In fact, part of the problem is there's too much communication often now. Most schools have email systems within the school, so that pupils' work needs to be monitored carefully. So if you have a reduced timetable, the problem is if it's only for 6 weeks and you drop French for 6 weeks, how do you catch up when they come back? So that's up to the individual school to manage, and that management of the child in terms of what they're learning, what they need to catch up on, and so forth, is critical. And you're quite right. It's about building steps and the basics. I wouldn't have much truck with a school which didn't know when the pupils were meant to be in. That would be very poor communication. I think it's very straightforward. Schools generally ought to be able to share that information with all staff, so you know exactly when such and such a child is in school and when they're not. It's less of a problem for primaries, where there tends to be much better communications directly with parents. They tend to come into school. There's still many parents still don't cross over the boundary in secondary schools. I'll just pick up other questions. Do they question repetitive? Yes. Okay. The question is, Greg, do they question repetitive reduced provisions? No plan to get back into school. What happens when a child is not receiving education outside reduced provision hours? I'm not sure I understand the second bit, but we do pick up on the duration. So for instance, 0 to 6 weeks, that is essentially, as Greg said earlier, we send out a robotic email to remind them, okay, after 6 weeks, is he or she back in school? What's the plan? We follow that up a bit more robustly if it's from 6 to 12 weeks. Beyond that, then we hope to be in contact with schools, either through my team or through HIAS. And certainly children who have been on reduced hours timetables for a year or more, we take to the safeguarding board in Hampshire, because there is, for some of them, not all of them, I mean, if they're medically unwell, under, for instance, receiving treatment from CAMS and we're directed as to what they can effectively manage, that's different. But if it's because of the school's ability to cope with that child effectively, I'm always asking the question, is it the child who can't cope with school, or the school who can't cope with the child? And if it's the latter, then the school need to be doing other things as well. For instance, it may be that the child requires an educational healthcare plan to better meet their needs. Yeah, we do have a fairly robust way of challenging schools. And Greg, do you want to give some data on that? I mean, how many children have we got? People might be quite interested to know rough numbers, 0 to 6, that sort of thing.
Yeah, let me just scroll down. So again, this is data about last academic year. So that's 2019 to 2020. So by the end of that year, there was 75 children that had been on reduced hours provision for more than a year. There was 269 children that had been on reduced hours provision from between 6 months and a year. And then 422, that was 12 weeks to 24 weeks. And then there's a bit more children under those 12 weeks, which we would expect, because that's what we suggest, that children should only be on there for 6 weeks or a little bit more if providing the appropriate context. So 6 to 12 weeks was 364, and 0 to 6 weeks was 388. Again, that's based on all the information that the school can provide to us. So sometimes if schools are not forget to update us, or they're not best at keeping up their updates, that's based on what we know. So it could be that a child has closed their reduced hours provision a couple of months ago, but they just haven't told us yet. So yes, it's based on what the schools can tell us.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah. Somebody's asked the question, how many children with an EHCP on reduced hours? Well, I can tell you that. Last year, approximately a quarter, 328 of all children in receipt of a reduced hours provision were in receipt of an EHCP. 56% of those were in primary education, and 26 of those children were in year R. So that's quite interesting. So even with EHCP, 300 odd children were, not odd children, but 300 numbers were on reduced hours provision. And that does raise questions for us. I'm sure it raises questions for you as well. But if you've got an EHCP to meet their needs, how come they're on a reduced hours provision?
The rate of closure for those children is slower as well. So the children that are on EHCPs, they appear to be on reduced hours for longer than children that are not in EHCP. So the rate of the reduced hours provision closing is slower. So that again has questions that a child with EHCP is on reduced hours provision, and B, it's quite lengthy when they are.
There's a question here about what happens to schools that don't report to the inclusion service. I think I probably answered that. It's in their best interest to report it, and schools get that. Where they don't, and where they're more awkward, and we have 1 or 2 cases, mainly academies, then we will take it to the regional commissioner, full stop. And I haven't had to do that yet, but I've had close to threatening it with 1 or 2. It never happens.
Dave, can I ask a question?
Yeah. Of course.
Hoping you can hit. You mentioned before as well that Ofsted don't like it if schools aren't reporting, but how do Ofsted find out? How do you find out that a school isn't reporting? How would a parent know that the school isn't reporting so that actually can get fed back?
Okay, I mean, Ofsted can find out. Okay, how do Ofsted find out? First of all, they may well ask the school. And if a school said they had no children on reduced hours provision, you'd be a pretty foolish head to say you had none when you have some, because the head wouldn't know how the Ofsted inspector would know. Quite often parents will write independently to Ofsted. Normally, if parents write to Ofsted and it's about an individual pupil, Ofsted don't actually investigate it themselves. They come back to the local authority and they ask us to investigate it. So in that route, we know about it. So Mrs. Bloggs phones Ofsted or writes to Ofsted, says my child's on reduced hours timetable, I'm not happy, blah, blah, blah. They would then pass that on to the local authority. So my team, that will come down to my team, we would approach the school. If the parents haven't reported it to Ofsted themselves, Ofsted just turn up at the school, and how would they pick up reduced hours provision? The answer to that question is they might, and they might not. Most heads wouldn't want to take that risk of being caught out, to be quite honest, because it could immediately be considered a safeguarding issue, and that would put the school in a category. So you would expect the schools to inform us. They could do a register check. I mean, if Ofsted do that, they can look at attendance figures, and you can see patterns fairly clearly. So I can't guarantee that Ofsted will pick it up, but I think most schools wouldn't want to take the risk. Does that answer the question?
If it was your question, you're welcome to unmic yourself and just say yay or nay.
Okay.
Carry on then, Dave, I would.
Right, how do parents know to contact the inclusion service? Again, that's a good question. We're out there, we're on the websites. It comes through to us in various ways. If you ring, parents can ring or email direct the inclusion support service to talk to us, and lots of parents do. They find us through the website, or if they go through to something like Hants Direct, then it'll be redirected to us. If it's a question around reduced hours provision or elective home education or anything to do with exclusion or attendance, it comes through us way. I can put the contact details chat. Yeah, okay. Happy to put contact details. The telephone number for the inclusion support services 01962 876 263. Another question, when PRUs decline referral for medical reasons, saying private diagnosis actually, okay, all crumbs. Okay, let's talk about medical referrals, because this is a real contentious area. Okay, last year I led the rewriting the Hampshire medical policy. If you haven't seen that, I will send it along after this meeting so you can see it. And we were due to have a review of the medical policy this year. I haven't had that review yet, partly because of COVID, and it's just taken over the world, and partly because the medical policy has been incredibly well received. We've had very few complaints about it. Schools, parents, agencies. It's a good piece of work, but I would welcome feedback on it, and certainly that's worth doing. We do suggest that a medical referral, we do have to have some kind of medical evidence. The problem comes where it's mental health, and there is often very little medical evidence available. Because CAMs are so far behind, and it's a resource issue with the NHS. So you can wait up to 9 months for an appointment. In that time, the child may not be coming to school, and the school often question whether the child can come into school. There's lots of issues about what a parent's doing. Is it a parenting issue? Are parents condoning absence? And sadly, that is the case in some cases. So very often it becomes an attendance issue as opposed to a medical issue. What our medical policy basically says is, look, let's use a bit of common sense here. If the child is missing school because of emotional mental health issues, then make a referral and we will triage it. And then we do a little bit more investigation into the medical referral. Unfortunately, GPs will write what parents tell them to write. If you've only got 7 minutes and you've got a parent on your back, they will often say, GPs will often say unhelpful things like the child is not fit for school, when the child may well be fit for school. So we have to use our common sense, but nevertheless, GPs will write. Evidence shows they will write what parents ask them to write sometimes. And then we come into the whole area, which is really contentious, around whether the illness is fabricated or not. And that is a nightmare for my service and for schools and for parents, because very few cases are fabricated, but sometimes they're exaggerated. And it can get very tricky, and it requires an awful lot of work around that. Which brings us on nicely to the EBSA documentation, which came out last week, which is all around emotionally based school avoidance, which is not when children won't attend school, it's they can't. And generally it's about mindsets, and I'm trying to move all schools to the mindset that there are some children who genuinely cannot attend school and they need an awful lot of support. And that documentation is really about moving things forward for those individual children. Getting back to the question, sorry.
Just popped a link in the chat where people can find the EBSA documentation.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we genuinely, that was released last week. It's heavily based on West Sussex, who did the pioneering work. What we've done is we've updated it with permission of West Sussex, myself and the Hampshire and Kiva Weeks, who's an EP for Hampshire and Isle of Wight Educational Technology. And we really would welcome feedback on that document. And that document is up for review. Will be reviewed over the next year as we get feedback from schools, parents, and everybody. It's a start. It's in that sense, it's not a finished document. It's an ongoing document. Happy to talk further about medical referrals, but they are the mental health ones are really tricky, and it takes a lot of understanding on all sides. Long-term reduced action. Long-term reduced hours, is there any action you can take? Yeah, there is, and we do. We talk to schools and we need to move it on. We can't have a child on a reduced hours timetable or reduced hours provision for years. They need to have the right provision. In my opinion, schools often use where children have behaviour issues. Right, okay, first of all, reduced hours provision for behavioural issues is probably more frequent in primary schools than secondary, where the child yet hasn't got an EHCP and where the child is really struggling, often anxiety, attachment issues, some really difficult, I mean, I could describe some, Greg and I could describe some really difficult situations where children are in real flight or fight mode. Then basic needs aren't being met. So for those of you who know Maslow, it's basic needs stuff. And the behavior is communicating something. Is what they're communicating. So that work, a lot of primary schools are generally very good. We have the primary behaviour support service, which supports hugely on that. And at any one time, I've probably got 10 to 20 cases rumbling away in the background where the children find it really difficult to come into school, and the behaviours are incredibly extreme. And we're talking here about extreme violence because of their flight or fight condition, hurting staff, hurting other children, wrecking classrooms, spitting, which is a particular problem at the moment with COVID, because they know that they're not meant to spit, and so spitting is a way of communicating, I really don't want to be here. That's unpleasant at the best of times for staff, but even more serious during COVID. Running away from parents, running away from home. Sometimes all the issues are in school, nothing at home. Sometimes the child is perfect in school and awful problems at home. So it works both ways. Yeah, there are children of behavioural issues. At secondary level, we would hope that by the time a child reaches year 7, that any special needs have been identified, either with or without an EHCP. Often they're not, and then that does cause the secondary school problems, and behaviours can be very challenging to deal with. For children who are on reduced hours timetables, some of them are also involved in out of school activities, which are a danger to themselves, substance misuse, gangs, county lines, generally being a nuisance in the neighbourhood. In an ideal world, you want those children in school. part of the issue, I guess, is that the curriculum that schools have to offer, and I think we need to bear this in mind, that successive governments over the last 10 years have narrowed the curriculum. It's a very academic curriculum now. So very often the opportunities for these children aren't meeting their needs. They don't necessarily need 8 GCSEs in English, maths, science, history, geography, RE and so forth. What they actually need is probably a mix of that and a more vocational education. But of course, vocational education is tough for schools these days. So there are children in years 10 and 11 who are on reduced hours provision for those sorts of reasons. It's not normally because they don't have enough staff. That doesn't, I know, I'd be surprised if the school said we don't have the staff. No, that's not an adequate reason, really, is it? So again, I think if I was a parent in that position, I'd want to have a conversation with the school about the curriculum they're providing and what support does the child need, and if the child has specific learning needs, how are they meeting those needs? And it's not always a question of an extra LSA. How many schools say they can't cope with a child? Normally it's primary schools, primary, and they generally can't. I mean, a child who's, I've got a case currently very live for me where the school genuinely cannot meet need and they're waiting for a special school place. There are no special school places available to September. So how do you best meet that child's needs between now and September? That's the question for the school. And that does happen. It does happen at secondary level as well. We have an escape valve in the education centres if the behaviour manifests itself in such a way. But it's fairly rare. Normally schools, most children are mainstream, therefore the schools have to be able to meet their needs. Can a reduced timetable or an 18-20-hour week at the home school be written into an EHCP with a view of providing additional? Yes, it can be. The EHCP, the Educational Healthcare Plan, can set out what the child requires. So quite often a child may require some kind of therapy or therapeutic or some physicality that can be worked into the EHCP, and then it wouldn't be a reduced timetable. So if they spent, for instance, I don't know, let's say Tuesday afternoons equine therapy, that's part of their timetable. So that wouldn't register with my department because it's not a reduced timetable. They're getting a timetable bespoke to their needs, which is good. Does a member of staff from the inclusion service ever attend meetings about the child on EHCP? The answer to that is rarely. That would be, generally speaking, and it's a rule of thumb, my department deals with children who do not have an EHCP. They're either on the route to it. Once a child has an educational healthcare plan, then that falls into the remit of the SEN department. That said, I often do get involved. Communications with my team are very good, so we often spend a lot of our time talking to the SEN department when parents can't always get through, talking to the school and trying to mediate a solution. So we do talk. I will discuss children who've got EHCPs, but they're not our prime business. Let me just have a look. If a child has an EHCP and still on reduced timetable greater than a year, what can be done? Right, I think what I would be saying earlier than the year is, hold on, this is not, the child's needs aren't being met appropriately. You need to call an early annual review and you need to review that child's provision. And it may be that the EHCP, the school need to do more, or it may be that the child's not in the right provision. But those things need to be picked up. Just looking at any more questions, hold on. What support should be available to parents, carers when a pupil is on a reduced and at home? Okay, really good question. A child on a reduced hours provision and is at home, the the school have a duty to make sure that that child is safeguarded. So first and foremost, is the child being looked after? It's either the parent or another carer or a relative or something along those lines. Very often children on reduced hours timetables have got multi-agency involvement anyhow. So it may be that they're known to social services, early help hub. Sometimes the issues spill over into school, and it may be that there are parenting issues, and that might be addressed through an early help hub referral. But in terms of the school, when the reduced hours timetable is created, need to be asking the question, okay, what's happening on Wednesday at 12 o'clock when little Fred goes home? They may be able to offer learning family support workers and so forth. If a parent says, I cannot cope with my child at home, he should be at school, then the school have got to think again about whether the reduced hours provision is appropriate. How much leeway is given to schools because of COVID? Right, well, the current situation is very different. The problems currently are a lot of alternative provision is not available. It's just not happening because of COVID. There's also the issue that a lot of outreach work from special schools also isn't operating at the moment because of COVID restrictions. PBSR, primary behaviour service, pardon, medical home tuition, for instance, will continues with risk assessments. Most cases work fairly well. There are one or two tricky cases. I mean, we've got one set of parents, for instance, who are in denial of COVID. So I made the call. It wasn't safe for the home tutor to go into the home because, you know, the parents weren't taking any, if you don't recognise COVID, presumably you're walking around without a mask on and so forth. But the vast majority of cases, we do a risk assessment, and parents, if parents are happy to have the tutor in the home, then obviously the tutor takes lots of precautions and all the rest. That can still happen. At the moment, remote learning has gone from very sparse and poor back in March 2020 to every school now has a duty to do remote learning. That's great, but remote learning is no substitute for face-to-face teaching. And it's actually, there are a number of issues emerging with remote learning. I mean, it's exhausting for the teacher, actually, as well. But it's also exhausting for children to be at the end of a computer screen all day long. For some, you could argue it's better that they're at the end of that as opposed to playing Fortnite or whatever else they're playing on. But nevertheless, remote learning isn't always the answer. And there are also some children who can't do remote learning for whatever reason. So at the moment, to answer the question, I think quite a lot of latitude is given, but we rely on schools to focus on their vulnerable children. And of course, vulnerable children are entitled to a school place at the moment. The issue comes when those vulnerable children who are entitled to a school place don't attend school and don't access remote education. And that's where schools and Hampshire County Council work together to encourage the parents to engage.
Can I ask a question there, Dave?
Yeah, of course. Who's asking it? Sorry.
That's Sarah. Sorry. So are you saying that vulnerable children are actually obligated to be in school in the current climate?
No, they're not obligated. It's a parent's decision, but the schools, all vulnerable children should be in school. That's what the schools.
Okay.
So that includes children with EHCP. They come under that category. So the school should offer them a place. A number of parents, however, don't wish their children to be in school at the present time. And if that's the case, then they don't have to turn up. But I suppose
it's a tricky one, isn't it? It needs to be based on a risk assessment, because a lot of vulnerable children have sound medical reasons for not being in school currently.
Yeah, tell me about it. Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time last term. The terms, you may be familiar with the terms clinically vulnerable, CV, and clinically extremely vulnerable. And last year, basically the advice was in the September term, a child who's clinically vulnerable should be in school. Exceptions were made by the DfE for children, and even clinically extremely vulnerable. So we had a lot of issues around that. We also had issues where the child was perfectly healthy, but the parents were perfectly unhealthy, i.e. that they were clinically extremely vulnerable. And we did bend DfE guidance to say that those children needn't necessarily be in school. They can access the remote learning, but the DfE line was they should have been in school. And we issued guidance. I issued guidance to schools about that, because we did have a small number, but significant number of parents who genuinely were, clinically extremely vulnerable, and were at risk of death, quite frankly, if their child brought COVID home. And the DfE,
yeah, I think that's a very tricky situation.
Oh God, it was awful.
And there's
huge sympathy for the parents, and we needed to move the DfE on that one, and we did. So I speak with the DfE.
I think there's quite often a correlation between we see a correlation often between children with additional needs and parents with autoimmune diseases. I'm not sure it's very true. Right. Thank you very much, Dave. You've answered all those questions I've put through to you.
Have I? Greg,
okay,
is there anything you want to...
Dave, can you turn your camera off?
Camera off. Yeah, I can.
Hang on, let's just try. Yes. Right. I hope that might mean that everyone can hear us a bit better. We've just reduced the bandwidth. So a huge thank you to Dave, who has been handling all the questions that I've been passing through to him on chat. I really appreciate your time and those questions answered. I will pass that chat stream on to Dave and Greg so they can see. There's a few comments that I haven't passed through on there. If anybody would like to save the chat, you've got 3 little dots next to your chat stream, links to the documents and the links to the other events. I'm really sorry that the technology hasn't quite worked for us as well as it usually does today. It's really hard doing these things when I can't make even virtual eye contact with Dave and Greg and give them a nod. So we will be recording this. We have recorded it, so I'm not sure what that'll end up looking like, but it will be there and it will be made available through HPCN social media channels. If there's anything else you want to put in at the end of the meeting, but I'm going to say a huge thank you to Dave and Greg for coming and joining us this morning and putting up with the challenging technology. And for those of you who've joined us, I hope we will see you again at an HPCN session soon. I've put the details in the chat of our next parent-led clinic session with CENDIAS that some of you might be interested in. All our sessions are available on the What's On section of the HPCN website, or you can actually join our newsletter mailing list through the link that I've also put in the chat. So I hope that's been helpful. Thank you for those of you saying thank you. Really appreciate that. Really appreciate Dave and Greg's time. I'm going to call it to a close now and halt the recording. Dave and Greg, anything else from you?